Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen with CCJ 3701, Research Methods in Criminology, and this is the answer key to Lab 7. So that way, if you had mistakes on here or struggled with the interpretation, we're going to review this and go back through everything so you can get a chance to correct your mistakes and move forward in being able to know how to do this for your final paper. So let's get started. The lab asked you to open up the general social survey and deal with this question. We want to predict how much education a person receives by knowing other things about them, their gender, their religious orientation, and how they feel about spanking. Later on, it says we're going to prepare variables for analysis and run a regression. First task is we're going to create a new variable about spanking. And it suggests you're going to use 1 to indicate favoring spanking and 0 to say I don't favor spanking. So let's go ahead and start that process. Remember, in SPSS, we never analyze a variable we don't know, so we have to go find the spanking variable first. And again, you can do that by clicking in the label field, hitting Control F, typing in a word like spank, and it'll take you to all the instances that occurs. And lo and behold, on row 681, there is a variable called spanking. So we're going to go ahead and go to Analyze, Descriptive Statistics and Frequencies. And in the frequencies menu, we're going to add our spanking variable. Remember, when you're in this menu, you can right-click inside this list and flip it from displaying names to displaying labels. So whichever is easier for you to navigate. I usually use variable names. Then I can start typing in SP to find my spanking variable, but I already went ahead and put it in my queue. So that helps me get to it a little bit faster. Once you've selected spanking, click OK. And here is the output on favoring spanking to discipline a child. So we're getting familiar with what's in this variable and what it means, okay? We also need to look at the value labels. Okay, we can see here we do have some missing data: inapplicable, don't know, not applicable, and so forth. So remember, our frequency is the people that gave that response, the number of people that did. We have percent that shows you what proportion of the total they are. Valid percent does it for only the valid responses, not including any of the missing data. And cumulative percent shows you how they kind of add up as they eventually get to 100. Okay, I'm going to close this output for now because we really don't need it. And we're going to look at the value labels so we can develop our plan. So here we have some missing data that we have to deal with 0s, 8s, and 9s. 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s are the valid responses that we're going to make changes to. Again, we're going to change this variable from an ordinal variable, indicating how much they agree or disagree with something, into just a nominal variable telling us if they do. So ordinal, we can kind of rank the responses to show us more or less agreement or disagreement, but if it was just nominal, we would just know what the response was. Okay, so the plan we want to implement would look something like this. So you have the old value versus the new value. We're going to deal with 0s as missing data. 1s and 2s are going to become a 1, 3s and 4s are going to become a 0, and our 8s, 9s, and system or user missing is going to become missing. So it's really important to develop a scheme that you can kind of jot down and follow, so that way when you're in the recode menu, you don't get lost. That's a mistake a lot of people make in the class. So let's go into Transform menu, recode into different variables. And you can tell I was already working on it before. But go ahead and find your spanking variable, put it into the queue. We're going to go ahead and name it spanking recoded, and we'll go to old and new values. In here, we're going to go ahead and remove all this stuff and just put it in one at a time, just to again show you the different ways of putting this stuff together. Okay, so we could say 1 is 1, 2 is 1, 3 is 0, 4 is 0, but you could do ranges as well. Okay, let's start with the valid responses first. Now we want to treat 1s and 2s the same, so we can do a range of 1 through 2 being a value of 1. We can do the same thing with 3s through 4 being a value of 0. So this plots the strongly agrees against the strongly disagrees and the agrees against the disagrees. Now let's handle the missing data. So we need to say 0, the inapplicables are going to be treated as missing, our 8s and 9s will also be treated as missing data, as well as any system or user missing will be treated as system missing data. So that should be our scheme handled together. We're going to hit continue, then hit change and click OK. Now this is a part that a lot of people skip. You have some syntax that shows you that the recoding changes were made. You'll want to go back in to Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, and Frequencies to check the original variable against the recoded one you just made. Again, sometimes you have to hit this reset button at the bottom to refresh and repopulate your list from variables you just made because SPSS hasn't added them yet. We'll pop it in our queue. We have them side by side. We'll click OK. And now we can look this over to see if everything came together the way we planned. So here we have our strongly agrees and agrees, and they came together as a total of 950, and our strongly agrees and disagrees came together as a total of 358. So just by doing some simple math, we can tell that these categories were combined properly. Okay, so according to the lab, we wrote out our coding scheme. We can now answer number 2, that 950 people favor spanking. Now comes the tough stuff, running a regression. So the first thing is to identify which variable is which, because if you don't know that, you're not going to know what to put into the regression queue. Run a regression that assesses whether or not feelings about spanking affects the number of years a person completes, net of or taking into consideration whether they are female, whether they're fundamentalist, and so forth. So you have to identify which variables are which so you don't mix them up. So generally the first variable here is the dependent, okay? And then we identify spanking as simply an independent variable and the other two variables as control variables, okay? Then there's this little note. You need to decide if the variables need to be recoded or not before running your analysis. Let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to run a few more frequencies on variables that we're going to analyze. So we're done with the spanking variable. I'm going to put those back for now. And let's go get the EDUC variable, education. We will also get the sex variable, and we will get the fundamental variable. We'll look at those three together just to check them. So here's education. It says highest year of school completed. This is the years of education a person got, and the number next to them is how many people responded saying, yes, I got that many years. 10 years, 13 years, 17 years. Now, generally speaking, a variable like this, if you had 12 to 13 years of education, those essentially would be your high school graduates. If you had 16 years of education, those essentially are your college graduates. And then over that, the 17, 18, 19, 20 would be people that have graduate or professional degrees in addition to a bachelor's. So this is actually an interval variable. It's a quantity. How many years do you have? Down here, this is the sex variable indicating gender, male, female, and it tells us who answered what. And then on the bottom, we have the fundamentalist variable, and whenever it says R in the general social survey, that means respondent, so how fundamentalist is the respondent? Fundamentalist, moderate, liberal, and it shows us the breakdown of how they answered. These last two variables are definitely nominal variables because they're categories that we don't really do numerical things with so much. We just like to rank the categories against each other and make comparisons and stuff like that. Okay, so we definitely need to recode these categorical variables to make the comparisons that we are interested in for the analysis, but we do not need to recode the education variable. It's perfect as it is right out of the box because linear regression requires that we have an interval variable as the dependent. And in fact, that is our dependent variable, so it gets to stay as is. But let's work on the sex variable as well as the fundamental variable. And this is where a few people did not have an easy time because they realized they had to recode it and had to go back, and it was probably a little frustrating. Okay, so first we have to look at these variables. So let's check out the fundamentalist variable first. I'm just going to go to that part of the variable view. I found it on row 223. How fundamentalists is R. Here are the values inside that variable. So right here it tells us there's a 0, a 1, a 2, and a 3. 8 is don't know. 9 is not applicable or excluded. So here we can develop our plan or coding scheme of what we're going to do. So in this case, we're going to make our fundamentalists our 1s, and then we're going to take our moderates and liberals and make them 0s to have a way to compare the two against each other. Okay? Anytime we do a this versus that variable, you have to have a comparison group and you have to have a group you're interested in looking at. That's the only way to test for differences. If everyone is a 1 in the variable and there are no zeros, then your variable will get kicked out of the equation because it has no variability to it. Everyone is the same answer, and there's no way to tell if that status, identity, or behavior makes a difference because there's no one to compare to. So you always have to have zeros and ones together. If you set the other groups to missing, then they're not going to be analyzed. It's like kicking them out of the analysis, and now you don't have any way to tell if differences exist or if being in that other category has an effect. So ones and zeros always have to go together to even see if effects happen. That's kind of the craziness that comes with dummy variables or 1-0 style variables, but they're very common and very popular. Okay, now we're going to look at the sex variable. Okay, it's going to be a few places down on the survey. There it is, row 664. We're going to close this. And here are the value labels. 1 is male, 2 is female. This is a pretty simple variable. People tend to know their gender, so you don't really have missing data on this one, so that makes things easy. So let's go ahead and do these recodes. We'll start with fundamentalist. So we'll go to transform, recode into different variable. We're going to put back the last one we worked on so we can start fresh on our new variable. There's fundamentalist. We'll pop it in there. We're going to call this fundamentalist recoded, just for simplicity's sake. Now we're going to define those old and new values. So we can keep some of this, but other pieces we need to remove. Okay, so we're going to keep the 8s and 9s, the system missing, the system or user system missing, and the zeros, because those are actually the same in this variable. They did that the same way. But we're going to change the other values a little bit. So a value of 1, which is fundamentalist, we're going to set as a value of 1 again. A value of 2 or 3, we're going to set as a value of 0. Okay, so this is the coding scheme you should have used in the fundamentalist variable. Click continue, change, and OK. And again, you would want to check your variable. It takes just a few seconds to do to make sure you did it right. So we're going to get the original fundamentalist variable, compare it to our new fundamentalist variable, side by side, make sure everything is how it should be. This also reveals errors. So I had 552 fundamentalists in the original variable, and I have 552 here in the new one. The other two categories combined, 757 plus 623 equals 1380. So I know I did this recode correctly. That variable is now ready to go. Of course, we can go in and label everything, but I'm going to skip that step for now so I can show you the sex or gender variable. Okay, so now we're going to work on our recode for gender. Recode into different. I'm going to put the fundamentalist variable back. I'm going to find the sex variable, put it in. I'm going to call this sex recoded. And I'm just going to copy that name, use it for the label as well. And in this case, I can remove most of what's in here from the last recode. And again, this is SPSS trying to be convenient. So our value of 1 is male. We're now going to set as a value of 0 because that's who we want to compare to. Our value of 2 is female. We're going to set to a 1. Okay, and then any system or user missing will set to missing, but this one actually doesn't have any missing data, so it won't really do very much. But that is the coding scheme for gender. Click continue, change, and then OK. Whoops, I think I have a space in there I shouldn't have. Yep, I do. Okay, now we're going to compare the variable. It shows us that it did the recode down here. Compare this variable to the original. So we go to Analyze, Descriptives, and Frequencies again. We're going to put our fundamentalist variable back. We're going to go get our sex variable. And then we're going to compare it to the new one we made. There it is. Click OK. And again, we should have the same number of males and females. They're just organized with different numbers. All right, now we're ready to do some analysis, and this is the tricky part. So we're going to take all of our variables that we recoded, as well as the education variable, and we're going to run a regression. So we go to regression, linear, and in this queue it asks us for the dependent and the independent variables. Go ahead and flip this to the variable names by using a right-click function. Let's put the education variable in as our dependent, and then we'll scroll all the way down and we'll go ahead and put the other variables in place as well. So that's going to be spanking, fundamentalist, and sex. They all get loaded inside the independence menu here because remember, a control variable is just another independent variable, one that doesn't get quite as much attention, but it is indeed an independent or a predictor variable. The other thing we tend to ask for in statistics is we'll ask for descriptives because this can help you populate your table a little bit. Click continue and then OK. So now here's some descriptive statistics. These are some of the averages. And again, averages on categories don't mean a whole lot to us, but the average highest year of school completed is 13. And now we have correlations in here. Okay. Again, we're not going to report on those because they're not terribly meaningful. But then we get down to the bottom. This is what we want to interpret and report on. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this so that you can get some good practice. So the first thing in here is our model summary. R squared is 0.030. Down here we have an ANOVA. Again, it shows us some of what was calculated in the equation, and it reminds us what the dependent variable was and what all the predictor variables were underneath. Then in the coefficients box, this is where we spend most of our time. Here is our constant of 13.877. Our spanking recoded variable of negative 0.529, our fund recoded variable of negative 0.928, and our sex recoded variable of 0.206. So these are all the coefficients, or basically the slope of a line in an equation that contributes to us being able to predict that line that shows how the relationship works between the variables. Over here we also have significance levels. Okay, which ones are significant and which ones are not. Remember, the constant is the y-intercept, or the place in which the line crosses the y-axis when x is 0. Okay, so let's slow this down a little bit and work through this interpretation. So if you got this output, you did it correctly. Now let's write about what the output means. Here's what it means in English. So this is what you'd want to prepare for your result for your lab, as well as any kind of result you write in your final paper. This is what you would prepare. Let's make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. Okay, so first, and again on the second page of the lab, I gave you some hints. Make sure you talk about R squared. You know, this is the coefficients. Make sure you talk about the constant. And here's a little reminder of how to interpret the significance levels. So those are the 4 things you tend to talk about inside a linear regression. So you could use that as your help. But let's start at the beginning. This is language that's pretty common when we describe statistics. I determined that there is a strong negative relationship between a person favoring spanking and how many years of education they complete. Let's go look at that in SPSS. Is there a negative relationship on spanking and education? Yes. Remember, the dependent variable is highest year of school completed or education, and it always reminds you underneath the box in case you get confused. But yeah, there is a negative coefficient here. It's a negative relationship, meaning as one thing goes up, another thing goes down, or vice versa. So you have kind of this inverse relationship going on. Then so that's a general thing you can say right there. Then you can talk about the constant, and we're going to get into some of the details of the numbers in just a minute. The constant, or approximate mean years of education a person completes on average, is 13.88. Okay, again, you can round if you want to, but there's the constant, 13.877. So that means, not knowing anything about a person, we'd expect them to have about 13 years of education. Okay, then it goes into these coefficients. A person who favors spanking has a negative coefficient of negative 0.530 year, meaning that people who favor spanking tend to achieve about 1/2 year less education compared to those who don't. That 0.5 relates to education in years. So all of these little coefficients relate to this dependent variable. This is how the years of education go up or go down. And 0.5 of 1 year is half a year. 0.9 of a year is almost a whole year. 0.2 of a year is maybe about a quarter of a year. So we want to see how much education changes, education increasing or decreasing, based on knowing these things about you. How you feel about spanking, your religious orientation, and your gender. Okay? But not all of these tend to matter in us being able to predict this. Okay? So remember, when we talk about nominal variables, it's always a 1 unit increase in x relating to a subsequent change in y. So a 1 unit increase in x, remember all these variables are 0, 1. So changing the variable by 1 is just changing from the zeros to a 1. So saying people that favor spanking versus people that don't have half a year less education. People that are fundamentalists versus people who are not have almost a whole year less education. And so that's how you go about it with nominal variables. This change over here relates to this change over here. Okay, let's go back to the interpretation. And you can also round it off by saying this relationship is statistically significant at the 0.05 level. So back in SPSS, at the end of this row where we have a coefficient for spanking, we also have a significance level of 0.007. Remember that we like zeros. Zeros tell us that there's a very tiny chance of it being false or not being true. So anytime you get those little p levels at 0.05, 0.01, or 0.001, it means you have a significant finding. When numbers are larger than these types of small zero decimals, it means you do not have a significant finding. Okay, so back to the interpretation. That's the first relationship we looked at. And then we looked at the gender. Females do not have a statistically significant relationship with years of education completed as compared to males. Let's look at SPSS. So we do have a coefficient here, and we have female is 1, male is 0. That if it was significant, it would tell us that females tend to have about a quarter of a year more education on average compared to males. But because the significance level is 0.231, that's a little too large for us to rule out chance that it's actually true. We like these numbers to be closer to 0 so that we're very, very sure, 95% sure or more, that this is an actual true finding. So while it looks like gender matters, it actually doesn't. Whenever you have an insignificant variable, basically all you can really say is there is no statistically significant relationship. Don't even bother to interpret the coefficient because it's not really worth it if you can't rule out chance that it's true. So that's all you can really say. It's just a simple statement saying these two variables don't have a relationship, they're not statistically significant, and that's it. And then our last variable, being fundamentalist, we can talk about this way. And these are just different ways of saying some of the same things. Being fundamentalist in religious orientation does have a highly statistically significant relationship with years of education completed. And we can remind the reader at what level it's at. Okay? It's the same thing as saying it's highly statistically significant, but you can kind of put in parentheses what the level was. Remember over here in SPSS, here's our recoded variable. It got triple zeros on the significance level, meaning it's a highly significant relationship. Knowing if someone's fundamentalist is very predictive of how much education they're going to get. It's a good way to predict that. Okay, then we look at that little coefficient. Back in SPSS, it was negative 0.928. That's almost a -1, meaning 1 year less compared to people who are not fundamentalist. So the way we would write that up, on average, a fundamentalist person that receives almost 1 year less education, and you can even tell the reader what the coefficient was, than those who are not, the liberals and moderates, they don't get as much education as they do. So that's just a very simple statement to say they get almost 1 year less education. And it's always helpful to remind the reader who the zeros are. You know, females compared to males, fundamentalists compared to liberals and moderates, people who agree versus people who don't agree. Because your reader might not remember who is being compared to. The very last thing we do in SPSS in your output, we've finished everything in the coefficients box. We're going to scroll back up to this model summary box and talk about what this R squared value means. That's probably one of the most important statistics you get, and I'll talk about this more in a moment. But over here, the R-squared value of 0.030 indicates that only 3% of the variance in explaining years of education completed can be accounted for by the model variables. That's why it's called model summary, because it reminds you of all the things you put in your little equation model, which was gender, spanking, and fundamentalists. So it says, out of all these things combined, how good are they at predicting education? Well, they only give you about 3% coverage. So anytime you get this R-squared, you can take that little value inside there, multiply by 100, and that gives you a percentage of how much variance or how much coverage you get with those variables. In this case, it doesn't cover a whole lot, and that's pretty common in social science, that we don't get a lot of coverage, but it still means that they matter, okay? So in the interpretation, we might say something like this. So explaining years of education completed can be accounted for by the model variables, and again, it's nice to remind the reader what those were. This tells us that there are likely other factors which contribute more to the explanation of how much education a person completes. And then after this, you might even write up a discussion section that makes suggestions, like maybe we should look at how much income they have, or whether or not their parents were also highly educated, or where they live, or how old they are. Those might be better predictors of how much education a person is getting versus just looking at some of these other things we studied. Okay, so I had a question from a student say, well, what really matters more, the R-squared or the significance level? Here's the answer. R-squared tells you how important things are in describing how you can explain a relationship. Significance levels tell us that they matter. Okay, so you can say, well, yes, your spanking opinion matters. Yes, your religious orientation matters. In this case, gender didn't matter. So you can say whether they matter, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are important in being able to predict education. They're not the most important things out there, but they do matter and they are predictive. So if that helps, R-squared tends to be the one that is most focused upon because of that. And in social science, we're predicting very complicated things, like whether you get arrested or how many drugs you use, or if you're going to recidivate, or feeling depressed. And those are complicated phenomena to explain. So we tend to get very low R-squareds because they often require lots of variables and lots of analysis to get even close to providing good coverage on what explains why things happen to people the way they do. So in social science, we get small R-squareds, but we do also get significant variables that tell us that things are related, that there is they do have something to do with each other. And that can still be useful in identifying protective factors or risk factors or things that we need to pay attention to if we want to do something about that behavior. Okay, so you just saw an entire lab done in 28 minutes. Of course, I had some things typed up ahead of time. But recoding you should be pretty good at by now. You can probably do it much quicker than you did back there in week 2 of the class. But just know that a lot of these labs, I know they can take a long time, but as you do them, you get faster, you get better at it, you start to become comfortable with the language and how to present things. But again, these are just different ways of saying things. You'll start to become more comfortable with the technicalities. And please reach out if you have questions. But hopefully you found this helpful. We'll talk to you later.